Okay. Well, good evening. Welcome to the Westport Library. Tonight's program on standardized testing for college admissions is brought to you by the Staples High School Guidance Department and the Westport Library. My name is Mary Parmalee, and I am the Director of Youth Services here. While you're silencing your cell phones, I want to take a moment to say how happy we are to continue our partnership with the Westport schools. Over the past 2 years, we have hosted numerous programs with Staples High School and are thrilled to be able to have one in person. Coming up on May 3rd, we have our fourth and final session this year of Spark Your Future. This webinar will feature Staples High School graduates working in the fields of environmental and health sciences. Actual people who sat in the same classrooms as you or your children will be online to discuss their current positions and to answer any questions that you might have. Having attended the previous 3 sessions of Spark Your Future this year, I can personally attest to how informative and inspiring Staples High School alumni are. On May 4th, we have our Teen Book Club, and on May 17th, we will be here with a college admissions panel, providing valuable insights, perspective, and sound advice regarding the college search and application process. Information on these programs can be found on the Westport Library website and from the Staples High School Guidance Department. For tonight, if you have questions, we ask that you hold them until after the presentation, as we have reserved time for them for a Q&A. Also, tonight's program is being recorded, so you can access this information again in the coming days. Please be on the lookout for communication from the Staples High School Guidance Department with information about how to access that recording. And now I would like to introduce Bill Plunkett, Director of Guidance at Staples High School. Welcome, Bill.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Mary, and thank you all for coming tonight, and to those of you who are joining us from home. We hope that you find this program to be helpful. Certainly, the college admission process has all sorts of nuances and ups and downs, and that's no more evident than with standardized testing. As you consider things like which test may be most appropriate, when to take the test, how many times, how to prepare. Tonight, we hope to demystify some of that, and who better to do it than a real expert who knows his stuff inside and out, I assure you. So Drew Heilpern from Summit, he graduated cum laude from Duke University with a dual degree in biology and elementary education. After teaching middle school science in North Carolina, Drew returned to Massachusetts for graduate school, where he earned a PhD in immunology from Tufts University. Soon after, Drew began tutoring for Summit, where his passion as an educator quickly made him one of Summit's most respected and requested tutors. His passion for tutoring students and helping families navigate the standardized testing landscape led him to a full-time position with Summit, where he's currently Summit's brand ambassador. As a guidance department at Staples, we've always had a lot of admiration for Drew and the entire staff at Summit. They've presented for us a number of times now. They also do a lot of professional development work with us throughout the year, and help with staying on top of the growing testing trends and changes. When we hear that students are working with Summit, we certainly know that they're in excellent hands. And this in regards to the potential for score improvement and maximizing their testing potential, but just as much so because I think you'll hear tonight that their philosophy is so much in line with what we ascribe to as counselors and caring about our kids. We consider this an individual process unique to each student. What we look for is a sensible approach that balances giving a concerted effort to achieving one's best and putting yourself in an advantageous position for applications, while at the same time being mindful of and keeping in perspective normal adolescent development, your child's well-being, and everything else that's on their plate, a strong sense of values and integrity. So whether you are or you have a 9th, 10th, or 11th grader, you should have recently received results from the March PSAT and SAT tests that were taken at Staples. Check your email for more information about accessing those scores and how to interpret them, and have your child visit the College and Career Center if they need any assistance. So again, tonight's program is being recorded, so knowing that there could be a whole lot of information that's going to be coming your way that we recognize could be quite a bit to absorb. If you'd like to go back and watch it again, you can, or if you have a friend who wasn't able to make it tonight. You can also pull up the PowerPoint notes from Drew's presentation on the Staples Guidance website under Programs, Calendar, and Important Resources. and we'll include a link in the follow-up message that we send out with the recording as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Drew.
All right, thanks, Mary. Excuse me. Thanks, Bill. So appreciate everybody coming out tonight. Huge thanks to the Staples guidance team and also the Westport Library for putting this or hosting this event tonight. I hope what I'm going to present tonight is helpful for all of you. Three major goals for the presentation tonight. The first one is really just to put these tests in context for you. They are not the be-all, end-all of the college admission process. Your sons and daughters' lives do not depend on their SAT or ACT scores. Having said that, we don't want to completely put our heads in the sand either, because depending on the schools that ultimately end up on your students' list, there might be some schools out there that will see the scores, put some weight on those scores, but anything we can do to keep the tests in perspective and not give them more life than they deserve is always helpful. And then second goal tonight, as the title suggests, I'm just going to walk you through the standardized testing landscape. We're going to focus on the SAT and ACT just so you have a better understanding in terms of the content and format of those tests. And then I'm just going to end this evening tonight by giving you some guidelines at a high level, giving you some things to think about as we dive into testing plans and things to consider as you're thinking about your students' testing plan. So with that, I will dive in. So I start with this slide. I start here because this is back to that idea that at the end of the day, these really are just tests. They're not the be-all, end-all of the college admission process. And what you're looking at here is this is a survey that's done by NCAT. So NCAT stands for the National Association of College Admission Counselors. Every year they do this survey, and what they're doing with this survey is they're reaching out to college admission folk, and they're just trying to give us a sense of these various criteria that you see here on the slide. How do they rank in terms of having considerable or moderate importance? And every year that NCAT does this survey, the number one response to this survey is always the same thing. The number one thing that colleges are looking at is a student's grades, their transcript, their day in and day out performance in school. The next thing that they're going to look at is what's called strength of curriculum. You'll also hear this referred to as rigor of the curriculum. Did students challenge themselves academically? Did they take advantage of the academic opportunities presented to them at their high school? And then you can see where the SAT and ACT scores fall into this survey. But I do just want to draw your attention to the footnote here. Just note when this survey was done. So this was done in 2019. So this was done pre-pandemic, this was done pre-COVID. Since COVID hit, NCAT has not done a more recent survey, but the next time that NCAT does this survey, we are anticipating that where the SAT and ACT scores lie is gonna drop. And the reason for that, which I'll talk about more in a little bit, is more and more schools have gone what they've called test optional. But even those colleges that are getting, for instance, like 40,000, 50,000 applications now, they are reading the essays that are part of that application. They are looking or reading the counselor recommendations. They are reading the teacher recommendations. They are looking at a student's extracurricular activities, any position of leadership they've had, any work experience they may have had, and all of these factors are going to get weighed into that final admission decision. And for those of you going through the college admission process for the first time, the term you'll hear around this college admission process is what's called a holistic review. And what the college admission officers are doing with that holistic review is they're trying to get to know the applicant as a person, not just as a number. So they're not just going to take a student's grades or GPA, put it in some kind of algorithm or formula with their standardized testing scores, and then make that admission decision based on that number. All of these factors are going to get weighed into that final admission decision. And I do want to spend a couple minutes here just talking about test optional schools and the test optional school landscape. So if your student applies to a test optional school, what that means, kind of as the name implies, is it's entirely up to your student to decide whether they want to include their standardized testing scores as part of that application or not. So in the fall of senior year, when they're looking at their scores, they feel good about those scores. They feel like those scores are reflective of the work they've been doing day in and day out in high school. They feel like those scores are supportive of their application. Even though they're applying to a test optional school, by all means, they will include those scores as part of that application. Those college admission officers will see that score, consider those scores, weigh those scores in that overall application read. But if, just for whatever reason, those scores came back lower than what your student was hoping for or expecting, really not reflective of the work they're doing day in and day out in school, if they're applying to a test optional school, they're not obligated to send those scores. Those college admission officers are not going to see those scores. Those college admission officers are not going to try to guess in terms of what those scores might have been. They're solely going to evaluate that application based on what they have in front of them. They might do a little bit of a deeper dive on the grades. They might do a little bit of a deeper dive on the transcript and on the rigor on that transcript, just to ensure that they feel confident that your student can handle the rigors of that particular college or university, but they do not need standardized testing scores to guide them in that admission decision. And what you're looking at here, so this is not an exhaustive list of the test optional schools by any stretch. I just picked these schools just to give you a sense that even prior to COVID, there were a number of schools and a number of selective schools that opted to go test optional. And I'll just point out a couple here. University of Chicago, for instance, they went test optional, I think it was like 4 or 5 admission cycles ago. Colleges like Bates and Bowdoin, they've been test optional like 10, 15, 20 plus years now. So I just put this up just to give you a sense that even prior to COVID, it was more and more selective schools that were opting to go test optional. It wasn't just kind of more rural schools or schools that might not typically appear on our students' list. And then COVID hit, and what happened was this test optional movement just got accelerated. So in terms of just giving you a little bit of context for this, here's where we are with the test optional school movement now. So for the class of 2021 and the class of 2022, almost all colleges and universities went test optional. And this was in direct response to the pandemic. Because of the pandemic and school closures and test centers being canceled, many students throughout the country just did not get an opportunity to take a standardized test. And the colleges realized it just would have been completely unfair of them to require standardized tests if students didn't get the opportunity to take those tests. So for the class of 2023, our current juniors and our current sophomores, they're in a little bit of a different school environment. Schools are remaining open. Students who want to take these tests are getting the opportunity to take these tests. But having said that, there are a number of schools we've already heard from that have already announced that they're extending their test optional policies. So just to give you a sense of this, all of the Ivy League schools, they've extended their test optional policies. Schools like Tulane, they just announced they're extending them. Stanford announced they're extending them. There are some schools out there that have announced that they're going back to requiring standardized testing. So MIT, for instance, a few weeks ago, they announced they're going back to requiring. We've also heard from some of the larger state schools, particularly in the South, that they're going back to requiring standardized testing. So like the schools in Florida, the state schools in Georgia, they've all announced they're going back to requiring. So take this with a little bit of a grain of salt, but if I were to predict just kind of where we're going to land in with the test optional landscape, my guess would be about 70% of schools remaining test optional, with maybe 30% of schools going back and requiring standardized testing. But we can say with a high degree of confidence that our students are, when they apply in the fall of senior year, there are going to be a number of schools on their list that are going to be test optional. So with that in mind, we really want students to see the standardized tests almost as a chance to show off a little bit. It's just another potential objective data point that they can share with colleges to show that they're academically ready for the rigors of that particular college or university. But just knowing, again, if those scores come back lower or come back not reflective, they're not going to be obligated to send those scores. So we really want students to see these tests more of like a everything to win, nothing to lose mentality. And then knowing if they go test optional, it's not going to hurt their application those college admission officers are just going to evaluate that application based on what they have in front of them. There are a couple caveats to the test optional movement just to be aware of. The first one is, especially if you're looking at some of those more selective colleges, the number of students submitting standardized testing scores is going to start ticking back up. So just to give you a little bit of context on this, so pre-pandemic, even though University of Chicago went test optional, it may have been upwards 80, 90+% of students who applied ended up sending standardized testing scores. And then for the class of 2021 and 2022, who were negatively impacted by COVID and didn't get the opportunity to take those tests, that percentage may have slipped to like 40, 50% of applicants submitting scores. But as students get the opportunity to take these tests again, I think we're gonna see the percent of students submitting scores is gonna start ticking back up. I don't think we're gonna get to that 80, 90% level that we saw pre-COVID, but it's gonna be higher than that 40, 50% we've seen over the last 2 years. The other caveat with the test optional movement is just around recruited athletes. So we don't have time to do a deep dive on this tonight, but if your student happens to be a recruited athlete, just know, even though they're applying to a test optional school, that college coach might still need standardized testing scores from your student. And the reason for that is those colleges just want to ensure that their coaches are recruiting student athletes that meet a certain academic standard and meet a certain academic threshold, and standardized testing still might be part of that eligibility requirement that they're looking for. And then the third kind of caveat around the test optional school movement is just around this idea of merit scholarship awards. So what a merit scholarship is, it's generally a non-need-based financial aid award. For those colleges that give merit scholarships, they're using it as a recruitment tool. They're trying to entice strong students to apply and ultimately enroll at their institution. And I just chose one example here. This is Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. You can see it's a pretty strong student, 3.5 out of a 4.0 GPA scale. But you can also see as the standardized testing scores go up, you can see the amount of that merit aid award also going up. And I don't want the take-home message from this slide to be, I don't want you to look at this slide and be like, oh my gosh, Drew, so we have to ensure that our students' SAT or ACT scores are as high as humanly possible in order to maximize this aid. It's more just putting it on your radar that back in my day, when we thought about standardized testing scores, we always thought about it in terms of something we needed to get in. But it's not just about getting in anymore, it's also potentially about maximizing that merit aid. And the reason why I talk about merit aid here, after talking about the test optional school movement, is just be aware that there are some test optional schools that admit test optionally, but when they consider these merit aid awards, they might be factoring in standardized testing scores. And the college admission officers, they try to be as open and upfront in their policies as they can be. So if you're applying to a test optional school that you know gives merit aid awards, you can always ask them, do they consider standardized testing scores in those awards or not? And they'll give you an honest answer in terms of what their policies are. And again, as Bill mentioned, I'm gonna hit you with a lot of information in a relatively short amount of time tonight, but if you only remember one slide from this entire presentation, this is the slide that I want you to remember. At the end of the day, helping students hit their full potential on these standardized tests comes down to having a testing plan. And that testing plan is answering 3 pretty straightforward questions. Which test should I take? When should I take them? And how and when should I prepare for them? And if you can answer these questions, hopefully what it's gonna do is just reduce some of the anxiety that always seems to surround these tests. Just students knowing when they need to have them on their radar and when they need to be thinking about them can go a long way in terms of reducing some of that angst. And I'll come back to these points, but I do wanna make them now. I know that there's huge pressures out there for early and often testing. Just keep testing, 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 and start that process earlier, and earlier. But keep in mind that performance on these tests, it does correlate with age, maturity, and time spent in school. So statistically speaking, the later students take these tests, the better they're going to perform on them. So for us, what that generally means is most students are gonna peak on these tests late spring of junior year, into that fall of senior year. And then the other point I want to make around the testing plan is there's many different paths to success here. At the end of the day, that quote perfect testing plan is what works best for you as a family and what works best for your student. So please do not worry. If your testing plan ends up being a little bit different than what a best friend is doing or what a neighbor is doing or possibly even what an older sibling ended up doing, that testing plan is going to be customized for your student. And then when we're talking about the standardized tests, these are the tests that we're talking about. So PSAT really just for practice. Colleges don't see PSAT scores. They don't make admission decisions based on PSAT scores. SAT, ACT is going to be the bulk of what I walk you through tonight. You can see subject tests has a line through them. So not to date myself, but subject tests, they've gone by different names. Back in my day, they were called achievement tests. They've also been called SAT 2s. More recently, they've been called SAT subject tests. These were just hour-long multiple choice tests that were offered in a number of different areas. And in January of 2021, in the height of the pandemic, the College Board, who creates these tests, also create the SAT, announced that they were getting rid of them. And when they made that announcement, we all kind of secretly cheered. It helped to simplify the standardized testing landscape a little bit. It was one less test that students needed to worry about. And when they made that announcement, how it simplified the landscape is, even though the subject tests, they were always such a small piece of the college admission process, they always seem to cause the most stress for students. So we always got questions like, Drew, do I really need to take these? If I do need to take them, how many do I need to take? When should I take them? What kind of scores do I need on them? And with this announcement, all of that went away. So let me just reassure you, the colleges are keenly aware that subject tests no longer exist, that your students do not have an opportunity to take these tests. They are not looking for subject test scores as part of your application. And then AP exams, just a little bit outside the scope of what we're gonna have time to cover tonight, but if you have questions around AP, please don't hesitate to ask. We'll circle back at the end. So we'll start with the PSAT. Again, really just practice for that SAT. Anytime students get an opportunity to take an official standardized test under real conditions, especially when it doesn't count, it's always good practice for students. And most students will take it in October of junior year. Some students will take it earlier. And then juniors will get their scores back in December of their junior year. And when students get their PSAT scores back, immediately what they focus on, and I totally get why they do this, but immediately what they focus on is what I'm gonna call that top line score. What was my PSAT math score? What was my PSAT verbal score? But the real benefit of the PSAT, it's not so much in that top line score, it's more in the itemized score report that you'll get back that shows every question your student answered correctly and every question your student missed. And if students have the discipline to go back through that itemized score report, just at a high level, it will give them an overall sense of their strengths and also their weaknesses. Just real quickly on the scoring of the PSAT, you can kind of get a sense of this the way the slide is organized. But these tests are all what they're called vertically aligned in their scoring. So what that means is you can use a PSAT score as a baseline score for the SAT because it is the score you would have gotten had you taken an SAT on that day. So for instance, if you got 550 math, 550 verbal on the PSAT, that 1100 would be your SAT score. But I always try to remind juniors, especially if they get their scores back and they're a little bit disappointed or they feel like it's lower than what they were expecting. Again, they're taking this in October of junior year. They're not going to peak on these tests until late spring of junior year, possibly even into that fall of senior year. So where students start on a PSAT and where they ultimately end up on an SAT or an ACT is often two different places. And especially if younger students have taken it, if sophomores have taken it, or even ninth graders have taken it, again, remember that vertical alignment. It's the score you would have gotten had you taken a full-length official SAT. Not going to peak on this to maybe a year and a half later in terms of after you've taken that original PSAT test. Always good practice, always good exposure in terms of what taking a standardized test looks like and feels like. But again, just do not worry if that score came back a little bit lower than what you were hoping for or what you were expecting. And I include this slide just to remind all of us that the two major tests that the colleges are looking for are either the SAT or the ACT. It's two separate tests, it's two separate organizations. They are in a market share battle with one another. You kind of have to think about this as like Coke versus Pepsi a little bit here. But colleges accept both tests equally. They do not have a preference for one test over the other. They do not see one test as a superior test and the other test as an inferior test. They are accepted equally. So at the end of the day, it does not matter if your student goes down an SAT path or if your student goes down an ACT path. It's really which test your student feels more comfortable with and which test they want to focus on. And I include this slide, this is more of a public service announcement than anything. So if you've been hearing the SAT or the College Board is changing the SAT, they are changing it, but it's only for the class of 2025. So our current sophomores and our current juniors are not going to be impacted by this change. And what the College Board is doing is they're moving to a completely online, digitally adaptive test. And with that change, what they're going to do is they're trying to shorten the test from 3 hours to 2 hours, giving students their scores back faster, and without going into huge detail in terms of what this adaptive test is going to look like, essentially each part of the test is going to have two components. There's going to be part one, where all students will take the same part one, and then the adaptive component where that fits in is depending how they do on part one, they're gonna get different questions and different sections based on how they did in that part one. So that's where the adaptive component comes in. And the advantage of an adaptive test, again, they can shorten it, still have it give an accurate score, so they can go from a 3-hour test to a 2-hour test. So for our sophomores and for our juniors, if you're hearing that the SAT is changing, you can completely ignore it. By the time this goes into effect, you'll be done with your standardized testing. So for any 9th graders or younger students, or if they're younger siblings, the College Board is going to give us more information this summer. They're going to release the actual specifications and specifics of this test. And then in the fall, they've said they're going to release some practice tests. So we'll actually get a better look in terms of how this adaptive test is, what it's going to look like. And we'll push that information out as we learn more. But again, just want to reiterate, for sophomores and for juniors, you can completely disregard this because you're not going to be affected by this change. So the test that I'm going to be talking about tonight is the one that our sophomores and juniors will be taking, the same SAT that our current seniors took and that class of 2021 also took. So here's a quick side-by-side comparison of the two tests, of the SAT and the ACT. And just looking at this slide, you can see that there is a lot of overlap in terms of the content between these two tests, but very, very different in terms of the philosophies behind them. So the SAT is more of what we call a power test. So harder reading on the SAT, questions are a little bit trickier, more misdirection on that SAT, trying to make things seem harder than they actually are. Whereas the ACT, reading's a little bit easier, questions are a little bit more straightforward, but the difficulty of the ACT comes from the pace of it. It's an incredibly fast-paced test. It's almost a total sprint from start to finish on that test. So students who take an ACT, or ideally a practice ACT for the first time, usually they'll walk out of that test and be like, Drew, I didn't think it was that bad. I just wish I had another 5 or 10 minutes per section. If I had another 5 or 10 minutes per section, I really feel like I could have crushed it. But that's where the difficulty of the ACT comes from. Most students feel rushed on it. Most students feel like they don't have the time they truly need to hit their full potential on that test. And you can kind of get a sense for that power on the SAT versus speed on the ACT just by looking at the reading sections here. So very comparable in terms of number of passages and number of questions, but on the SAT, students have 65 minutes to get through it, whereas on the ACT, they only have 35 minutes for that. The writing and language and the English sections, these are the two sections that are most similar to one another. This is the grammar portion of the test. On the SAT, that math no calc, that stands for no calculator. not trying to torment you by taking your calculator away, more measuring your math fluency. Can you do math without the use of a calculator? Do you know the math behind the math? And then you'll get your calculator back for that second SAT math section. ACT, a little bit more student-friendly, a little bit more straightforward. Students are allowed a calculator throughout, but the difficulty, again, is the pace of it. 60 minutes, 60 questions, it's about 1 minute per question. On the ACT, you can see there's this separate science section. It's not science per se. They're not going to ask you what's the chemical formula of photosynthesis. It's more deductive reasoning and logic. Can you work your way through a scientific passage? You might not know anything about that particular topic, but in some ways it's like a scavenger hunt. Can you find the information that they're giving you that you need to answer the questions? SAT, you can see no separate science section. It's a little bit forced, the way the SAT tests science. I'll circle back at the end of this side-by-side comparison just to give you a better feel in terms of what SAT science questions look like. So SAT, you can see that optional essay. It has a line through it. When the College Board announced that they were getting rid of subject tests, they also announced that they were getting rid of the essay. Very few colleges were looking for that essay. Even the colleges that wanted it, it was always very unclear what they were doing with that optional essay. Our thought was they were doing nothing with it. So the SAT kind of realized this and announced that they were getting rid of it. We keep kind of waiting for the ACT to make a similar announcement. They haven't yet. But again, same thing holds true. Colleges, they're not looking for that optional essay. They're really not doing anything with that optional writing score. So if you go down an ACT path, our general recommendation when you register for this test, don't worry with registering for it with the writing. Real quickly on the scoring of it, SAT 200 to 800 on verbal, 200 to 800 on math, so it's on that 400 to 1600 point scale. ACT, if you're not familiar with it, it's on a 1 through 36 scale. What colleges really care about is the composite score, and that composite score is just the average. So the average of that English, math, reading, and science scores. So what I'm gonna do now is just quickly, I'm gonna walk you through some side-by-side sample questions from the two tests, just so you get a better feel in terms of how that power of the SAT plays or compares to that speed of the ACT. Do not worry, I am not gonna call on any of you to answer any of these questions. It's more just to give you a feel for them. So I'll start with the writing and language and the ACT English, the grammar portions of these tests, and I'm gonna totally date myself with this joke, but back in my day, we had like a fountain pen, and we learned to write in cursive of all ridiculous things, and we wrote things like, "Dear Sir." Today's day and age, we're all communicating like this. It's all via texting and emojis and things. So both the SAT and ACT just want to ensure that our students have learned some grammar. So this is what it looks like on the ACT. SAT looks identical to this. Students are given passages with various grammatical errors and then asked to correct those errors as they work their way through that passage. So just number 8 here is testing verb tense. Number 9 is punctuation. Do students know the correct usage of a colon or a semicolon? Which then brings us to the SAT and ACT reading, and in some ways we've already covered this. Really the differences between these two sections comes down to the timing of it. So on the SAT, it's 65 minutes, 5 passages, 13 minutes per passage, whereas on the ACT, 35 minutes, 4 passages, 8.5 minutes per passage. And in the world of standardized testing, just a huge difference between having 13 minutes on a passage and 8.5 minutes on a passage. So just by knowing that, you can probably guess that SAT is going to require a deeper reading, a closer reading, a much more analytical reading. More questions along these lines, what can reasonably be inferred, and then for some of these questions, there'll be a follow-up question, which choice provides the best evidence? There's actually going to be line numbers in these answer choices here, forcing students to go back, do a deeper reading, a closer reading, almost a line-by-line reading of that passage. Whereas the ACT, they really don't have time for that. More questions along these lines. The passage points to this. In that limited amount of time, can you show that you read and understood the passage, understood that central argument that that author was trying to make? Which then brings us to everyone's favorite sections on these tests, the math. So these are both about slope of the line. I choose these example problems because I think they do a nice job of highlighting, again, that power of the SAT with that speed of the ACT. And the SAT one, I'll just read to you just so you can hear it. But the SAT one goes like this. The graph of the linear function f has intercepts at a0 and 0b in the xy plane. If a plus b equals 0 and a doesn't equal b, which of the following is true about the slope of the graph of f? And most students kind of have the same reaction that we all have, especially when I read it like that, which is true, like, what on earth? Like, what? Like, I don't even know what this question is asking me. So they could have asked this in a much more straightforward way. They could have simply said, the graph of the linear function f has intercepts at -2, 0 and 0, 2 in the xy plane. What is the slope of that line? And had they worded it that way, most students would read that and be like, oh, it's asking me to find the slope of the line between 2 points. I totally know how to do that. But this is where the misdirection comes in. For students to figure that out, they have to figure out that whole a plus b equals 0 and a doesn't equal b and how it relates back to that earlier part of the question. Whereas the ACT, way less interested in playing that misdirection game. Much more straightforward of a question. Students are given 2 lines. One of the lines has the slope of 3. They're then asked to find the slope of the perpendicular line. And you either remember that perpendicular lines have negative reciprocal slopes, or you don't. If you do remember it, you know it's C, -1/3. If you don't remember it, you're just kind of choosing your favorite ACT letter here and moving on to that next question. There's no getting inside the test taker's head. There's no trying to figure out what this is actually asking. You either know it or you don't. Again, that difference between that speed of the ACT with that power of the SAT. Other notable differences on the math. So the SAT has a much narrower and deeper focus. 60 to 70% of the math on the SAT is algebra, so algebra 1 and algebra 2. Obviously, if they emphasize something, they need to de-emphasize something. What they de-emphasized was geometry. So geometry is less than 10% of the math on that SAT. Again, that no calculator section, not trying to torment students by taking their calculator away, more measuring their math fluency. Do they know the math behind the math? Whereas ACT, much broader and shallower, more math topics on that ACT compared to the SAT. Only 30% is algebra. Way more geometry on that ACT compared to the SAT. Again, calculator allowed throughout, but the difficulty is the pace of it. 60 minutes, 60 questions. It's about 1 minute per question. Which then brings us to the ACT science section. And the ACT science section looks something like this. And it's designed to kind of overwhelm students. The first time students encounter an ACT science section, usually they're like, Drew, there is no way. There is no way in 35 minutes I'm going to be able to answer 40 science-related questions that refer to figures or graphs that look something like this. It's not actually as bad as it seems. I have no idea what an asthenosphere is. I have no idea what a lithosphere is. I don't need to know any of that to actually be able to answer this question. So according to figure 1, the temperature of the outer core is approximately between. So my first task is I have to find figure 1, which has to be this, because it's the only thing on the slide. And then I know the outer core is there, and I know how to read a graph, so I know I'm on the y-axis there, so I know I'm between these 2 dashed lines, I know I'm between these 2 points, so I know that answer choice is C, 4,800 and 6,300. I have no idea what I've found. I have no idea what that answer actually means, but I know that that's the answer. And this is where students struggle with the ACT. Because it's such a fast-paced test, the ACT has the tendency to turn on everyone's voice of self-doubt. And that voice of self-doubt goes like this. Drew, you did that awfully quickly. Are you absolutely sure that answer choice is C? And if I give into that voice, I'm going to double check this or triple check this or quadruple check this. And on the ACT, students just don't have time for that. So in addition to giving them strategies and approaches, it's also about building their confidence that they can see a question like this and without any hesitation or doubt, circle answer choice C and move on to that next question. So again, no separate science section on the SAT. It's a little bit forced the way the SAT tests science. Keep my background in mind when I talk about this because I am completely biased when I talk about this. But according to the SAT, students are demonstrating their understanding of science if they can interpret data from a table. I might argue there might be a little bit more involved to science than just interpreting data from a table. But even though we're in the grammar portion of the test or the reading portion of the test, they're going to have these data graphic questions, these science-related questions sprinkled throughout. So again, a lot of overlap in terms of content between these two tests, but very, very different in terms of the philosophies, with the SAT being more of a power test, more challenging questions, more challenging reading, requires a deeper understanding, a narrower focus of skills, especially on the math, with that emphasis on algebra, but more time per question. Whereas the ACT being more of a speed test, reading and questions are more straightforward, but does require that instant recognition, as we saw with that slope of the line math question and that ACT science question. Broader scope of skills, again, more geometry, more math topics on that ACT compared to the SAT, but again, the difficulty is the pace of it, almost a total sprint from start to finish on that ACT. Which then brings us to the million-dollar question. And the million-dollar question goes something like this, which is, all right, Drew, so we know colleges accept both tests equally. So just earlier on in the process, if we can decide we're going down an SAT path or going down an ACT path, it's just taking that potential amount of work and cutting it in half. But which test should we focus on? Should we go SAT? Should we go ACT? And I include this cartoon just because there's tons of urban legend out there that this type of student's going to prefer the SAT, this type of student's going to prefer the ACT. At the end of the day, the best way to make this decision is to try both, ideally in a practice setting, without the pressures of registering and sitting for official tests. And our general recommendation around practice tests is for sophomores who want to get a little bit of a jump on it. Over the summer, it's too early to be thinking or worrying about this now, but over the summer, it's a great chance to do a practice SAT and a practice ACT. We run them every weekend out of our New Canaan office. We can also just mail them home to you, so please feel free to reach out to take advantage of that. And then, again, it might be a little bit early to start any kind of formal test prep, but we can start mapping out, are you thinking SAT or are you thinking ACT? We also have juniors who will wait a little bit, also totally fine. They'll do the PSAT in October, and then around that time, they'll do a practice ACT, and then when they get their scores back for the PSAT in early December, they can compare their PSAT performance to their ACT practice test, and then they're off and running again for testing in that later spring. So again, no right or wrong way to approach this. It's really what's going to work best for you and what's going to work best for your student. And I know this is a little bit small, but here's the concordance table that's going to allow you to compare an SAT score to an ACT score. And this table is in the testing guide that many of you picked up. It's on the back table if you didn't get a copy of it. And just know, because the PSAT, it is your baseline score as if you had taken an SAT on that day. You can take a PSAT score and plug that right into this table as well. But just to orient us, 24 out of 36 on the ACT, the equivalent to about an 1180 out of 1600 on that SAT, and then 30 out of 36 on the ACT, the equivalent to about a 1370 out of 1600 on that SAT. Keep in mind, 70 to 80% of students who take both tests are going to score equally well on both. So often the decision whether to go SAT or ACT is really kind of up to your student's gut instinct a little bit. We joke with them, like, which one did you kind of hate the least? If you're going to do some prep for it, which one would you rather prep for? Which test do you think plays to your strengths? Which one do you think you're going to have an easier time getting that score to be more reflective of the work you're doing day in and day out in school? And then the next part of that testing plan, so when should I be taking these tests? So here's when they're offered. So you can see, with the exception of January, they're offered every single month. A couple years ago, the ACT added a testing date in July, the SAT added a testing date in August. So hooray, you can take these tests over the summer if you would like to. But we cannot stress this enough. Please, 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 please do not have this be your student's standardized testing plan. No one wants students to take these tests 5, 6, 7, 8 times. There's no need for that. The scores don't just keep going up and up and up and up every time students take the test. At a certain point, those scores are going to plateau. At a later point, you can actually see those scores start to drop because burnout on these tests is real. Most students aren't one and done on these tests just because the first time they take it, they're always a little bit nervous. But most students are going to peak on these tests after taking it twice, maybe a third time in that fall of senior year. And then just other general guideline, again, just earlier in the process, if we can decide we're going SAT or ACT, We're just trying to avoid going like ACT to SAT to ACT to SAT, and then rinse, lather, repeat on that in that fall of senior year. And then just know, SAT is part of the Connecticut State Assessment Test. So Staples High School will be offering the SAT as part of that state assessment in school, and the dates are usually later in March or in early April. So it's another, if you end up going down an SAT path, it's just another opportunity to take that test. But even, just know it is mandatory. So even if you end up going down an ACT path, you will be on that day be taking that SAT. Again, just it's good practice, right? Another opportunity to take a standardized test. So again, we don't want to do this. We want to do something a little bit more sane and sensible, which might look something like this. So this student came to us at the end of sophomore year, just over the summer. They did a practice SAT, did a practice ACT, scored equally well on both tests, as many students do. Had a slight preference for the SAT, so we ended up going down an SAT path. Took that PSAT in October of junior year, as many students will. Then that March SAT was actually part of their school day testing. Wanted to take it one more time in May, so 2 times in that spring of junior year. And then just coming out of junior year, just felt like her scores were not truly reflective of the work she was doing day in and day out in school. So wanted to try that test for that 3rd and final time in August before the start of senior year. If you end up going down an ACT path, it's going to look something similar to this potentially. The spring dates for the ACT are February, April, and June. We usually tell students to pick 2 of those dates. Again, whatever's going to work best for them. And then again, they have that fall of senior year for that 3rd and final time as needed. There's always exceptions to this. There's always reasons why we might push that timeline up. So for instance, recruited athletes, we might push the timeline up. Strong students who feel confident taking standardized tests, we might push that timeline up. But generally when we push the timeline up, we're usually pushing that first test to kind of like December of junior year. Just giving students, September, October, November, 3 months in school to get settled and to take advantage of everything they're learning day in and day out in school. Because keep in mind, everything that students are learning in school is helping them with these tests. So again, we don't want to do this. We want to do something a little bit more sane and sensible. And then just in the last couple minutes that I have here, I do just want to go over superscoring, just so you're familiar with this term. So almost all colleges where over 90% will superscore the SAT. So if you apply to a college that superscores, what that means is if your student's taken the SAT more than once, they'll send the full score reports from the different administrations of the test. But what that college is going to do is they're going to cherry pick the highest subsection scores and build what I call a Frankenstein score. So even though this student did not get a 1290 in a single sitting on that SAT, for those colleges that superscore, that 1290 is going to be your student's SAT score. A couple reasons why colleges superscore. The first one is you got to keep in mind that college admission officers, they read applications supportively. So they're looking for reasons to accept students, and superscoring is one way in which they can look at the standardized testing piece in that most supportive light. The other reason why colleges are superscoring, we all kind of loathe the US News and World Report rankings, but published SAT and ACT scores are still part of those rankings. So it's in the college's best interest to be able to report as high SAT and ACT scores as they can, and superscoring's one way in which they can do that. Let me just reassure you, for those colleges that superscore, they are in fact superscoring. So they're not going to look at these score reports, see the 580s on the reading and writing, see the 640. They're not going to ask themselves which one's the real one, should we average them together. They're going to take that 640 each and every time because it's in their best interest to do so. And then superscoring on the ACT, it works the exact same way. Slightly lower percentage of colleges superscoring the ACT. We're over 70% now, but every single admission cycle, more and more colleges are superscoring the ACT, and we're expecting that trend to continue. But superscoring on the ACT, again, works the exact same way. Student took the test 3 times, send the full score reports from the different administrations of the test, And then that college is going to cherry pick the highest subsection scores and then recalculate that composite. So same story, even though that student did not get a 31 in a single sitting on that ACT, for those colleges that super score the ACT, that 31 is going to be that student's ACT score. And then that last part of the plan, just how and when should I prepare for these tests? Just as we want students to do something sane and sensible in terms of taking the tests, we also want students to do something sane and sensible in terms of any prep that they do. So depending on their starting scores and their ultimate goal scores, most students are looking at about 16 weeks, 6 to 15 weeks of study and practice before that first official test. We don't want to prep for these things for like a year, year and a half, 2 years. It's too much. Students have better things to do with their time. And in that prep, really what we're trying to do is take what they're learning in school and then just helping them apply it to the types of questions and the different content that they're going to see on these tests. And in terms of what goes into the test prep, there's 3 major areas. So one is content, just knowing all the grammar that's tested on these, knowing all the math that's on it. The other is strategy, just a game plan for every question in every section. And then the best form of practice for these tests is practice, practice, practice on officially retired tests. So the SAT, the College Board, they've partnered with Khan Academy, and through that partnership, they've released 10 official SAT tests. So for self-motivated students, it's a great place for them to start. So those practice tests, they have full scales, full answers, full answer explanations. Khan Academy has also created some content videos just to walk you through some of the grammar and the math that's on those. So again, a great starting place for students who are motivated and want to do some self-study. So for the ACT, it's a little bit more low-tech on the ACT side of things. It's the red book. It's called the Official Guide to the ACT. You can find it in any bookstore. But there's 5 official practice tests in that book. Same story, full tests, full scales, full answer explanations. So again, for self-motivated students who want to do some self-study, it's a great resource and a great starting place for students. So I know we've covered a lot of ground in a relatively short amount of time. Thanks everybody for hanging in there. I hope this was helpful, but just to kind of recap what we've talked about. Again, most students are going to score the same, regardless of whether they go SAT or ACT. It is a little bit of upfront time and upfront investment, but just earlier in the process, if you can do a practice SAT, do a practice ACT, and decide if you're going to focus on the SAT or ACT, it just helps us to avoid going, flip-flopping back and forth between the 2 tests. But just be aware, because there is so much overlap between the 2 tests, any prep you do for one is going to help with that other. So if a student, for instance, decided to go down an SAT path and just feels like their scores are plateauing and not truly reflective and want to try that ACT, any work they've done on the SAT is going to help with that ACT and vice versa. And I know I've said this a number of times, but I do just want to reiterate it one last time because I know there's huge pressures out there for early and often testing. Just keep testing, 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 and start that earlier, earlier, and earlier. But because of that correlation with age, maturity, and time spent in school, most students are going to peak on these tests late spring of junior year into that fall of senior year. And when students are most ready to take them, that's when I want them to take these tests. Again, there's always exceptions to this, of course. That ultimate plan is going to be customized in terms of what works best for your student. But then I just leave you with this note. We know that the number one thing that colleges are looking at is a student's grades, their transcript, their day in and day out performance in school. So a good testing plan, it has to prioritize schoolwork over any kind of test prep. It does not do us any good to raise standardized testing scores if it's at the expense of day in and day out academics. And I know it's easy for me to say up here on this side of the podium, but really at the end of the day, these are just tests. They are not the be-all, end-all of the college admission process. We can say with a high degree of confidence when your students apply, they're very much going to be applying in a test optional landscape. There's going to be a number of schools on their list where it's going to be entirely up to them whether they want to include those scores or not. So really want them to see it as a chance to show off. It's just another objective data point they can potentially share with colleges. But again, want them to see these tests with with that attitude of kind of everything to win, nothing to lose on these tests. And then just a quick shout out to the guidance team at Staples High School as well. You could not be in better hands with them. They just have tons of experience, not only on the standardized testing landscape, but also on the whole college admission side as well, in terms of just guiding and working with families and guiding them through this process. So you could not be in better hands than with Bill and his team. And again, I know we covered a lot of ground tonight. We do have time for questions, but just if you're rewatching the recording and you think of anything, please don't hesitate to reach out. My email's there. We pride ourselves on being a resource to schools and families and students. And please take advantage of the free practice SAT and ACT tests that we offer. We run them right through the summer. We run them every weekend out of our New Canaan office. And check our website because I believe we're offering them in Westport as well. So just to make it a little bit more convenient for you. And those are free, so please take advantage of those. And then just as you get into this, if you're looking for a little bit of customized support, we do offer one-on-one, both in-home and online test prep and academic tutoring. So if you just want a little bit more customized support, we do AP tutoring as well. So if you have students who are enrolled in AP courses or preparing for AP exams, also feel free to reach out to us on that. All right, thanks everybody. I hope this was helpful. Again, we did record this, so you'll get a link to the recording because I know we covered a lot of ground, but we do have some time for questions. And then just if you can be brave because we're recording this and actually ask the question in the mic, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
So you showed that chart with the SAT and the ACT testing going down.
Yep.
And like, what's to make of that, if anything at all, and why it looked like a huge drop in ACT and a big
Yeah.
spike in
So without getting into it, the colleges accept both tests equally, so that's not impacting whether or not students are going for the SAT or for the ACT. That huge spike for the ACT you saw in 2016, that was directly correlated to the fact that the SAT, the College Board, changed their test in spring of 2016. So the test that we talked about tonight, those changes went into effect in that spring of 2016. So with that change, a lot of students were like, you know what, I don't want to be the guinea pig for this. We know the ACT, we know the ACT well, we know how colleges are using the ACT scores, I'm just going to go down that ACT path. And then as students started to get more comfortable with the SAT, as more and more students were taking it, you could see that gap starting to close. And then the SAT, they've gained some ground in terms of reaching out to states and having states like the state of Connecticut use the SAT as their state assessment test. So that's why you can see the SAT actually gaining in market share over the ACT now. But it's all just market mechanics. It has nothing to do with colleges preferring one test over the other. It's really that kind of market share battle that's happening behind the scenes there. So thank you for asking that. And also, we didn't have time to get into it tonight, but I do want to mention that if your student's on a 504 or if they're on an IEP and they have accommodations in school, they are eligible to get those accommodations for these tests. There is a formal application process that you have to go through. Your school will help you in terms of submitting all the paperwork that's required in that process. But 2 points to note. The first one is, it's not up to the guidance team in terms of approving those accommodations. They'll help you submit it, but it's up to the SAT and it's up to the ACT to grant those accommodations. And then also, because it's two separate tests and two separate organizations, if you had those accommodations for the PSAT, you have them for the SAT, you also have them for any AP exams your students might take, but you do not have them for the ACT. It's a separate application process for the ACT. You have to apply directly to them for those accommodations. The most common one is time and a half, that extended time, but just be aware that that is available to students if they need them and if they're using those accommodations in school.
So I know you mentioned frequent testing is not a good idea, and you showed the timeline. But just so we know, is there a downside to maybe attempting it a fourth time?
Yeah, so generally a fourth time, I'm 100% comfortable with that, because some students might take that first one, for instance, in, later in that fall of junior year, November, December, and then, end up taking it twice in that spring of junior year, and then just coming out of junior year I feel like there's a little bit more room there, and then trying it for that fourth, and final time in that fall of senior year. When I talk about, kind of like serial testing, I'm talking once you start getting, 6, 7, 8, 9 times, that's when it starts feeling a little bit excessive, and that's when students can potentially start burning out on it. But I mean, 4 times, we've had students take it 4 times, it's fine.
Thank you.
Hi. Do you know if the merit scholarships are in the practice of using super scores as well?
Yeah, so depending on the school, if schools are giving merit scholarship awards, and if they super score, generally speaking, they're going to super score for those merit scholarships awards. But again, you can always ask them in terms of what their policies are, and also how those policies apply to those merit scholarships. But generally speaking, if a school is willing to super score for admission, they're going to super score in terms of any merit awards that they might give as well. And again, keep in mind with test optional, there are schools out there that will admit and also give these merit aid awards completely test optional. So they're not going to factor in those standardized testing scores. Yeah, perfect.
Hi. In this day and age when more and more kids are taking gap years, not for academic reasons, but just to give themselves that year, is there a period of time during which a test has to have been taken in order to submit it for colleges, or does it get too old, I guess?
No. If you're doing a gap year, you do not need to worry that if you took those tests during high school, that those tests are gonna expire. They'll take them. But most students who do gap years, usually they will go through the college admission process in that fall of senior year, get admitted, pick a college, and then ask that college in terms of can they defer their enrollment because I'm going on a gap year and here's what I'm doing. And most colleges, and Bill, you can speak to this, most colleges will approve that. So most students who are on gap years or thinking about taking gap years, they'll actually have already done the test, done their full application, submitted them, been accepted, and then take that gap year. So when they return, they don't need to worry about applying. They're already in, and the college already knows that they're just going to be starting a year later.
Hi. First of all, thank you for doing this.
Oh,
and
of
taking
course.
Your time
Thanks everybody for coming out.
New Canaan in traffic. For the class of 2025, you mentioned in 2016 there was a change and then people flocked to the ACT.
Yep.
So how would you prepare for if you were in 2025 and there aren't going to be a lot of practice exams with the new format, or what are the ramifications of that?
Yeah, so for our current 9th graders, the good news on this is you have a lot of time on this. And the College Board, the last time they went through this change, they were actually pretty good about releasing practice tests and giving us the specifications for those tests. People, I think, they just felt a little bit more comfortable going down that ACT path. But I feel like even though it's going to be an online adaptive test, the transition from this test to that online adaptive test, I don't think it's going to be actually as big a shift as it was from that old SAT to that SAT that went into effect into that spring of 2016. So we're actually not anticipating to see that kind of dramatic 80% ACT to 20% SAT as we saw back in 2016. But by the time your students are going to be thinking about prepping for these tests and taking these tests, we are anticipating that there's going to be a number of practice tests that the College Board is going to release, because they also feel like they're a little bit ahead of schedule on this one than they were back in 2016. And I know this fall, their plan is to release a number of practice tests, and what they did last time was just periodically they released more and more and more. So by the time kind of your student in, sort of that fall of junior year there should be a number of practice tests kind of available to them. And then, all of us, for instance, like, we'll know exactly what's on the test. So in terms of our own materials, like, we'll be ready to work with students on those.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you all for attending this evening, and thank you, Drew, for talk about an information-packed presentation. I wish all of you luck with your testing plans. I can't imagine. I'm so grateful my children are old. But anyway, thank you for attending, and please remember to check the Staples High School guidance communications to you, because there will be information in there on how to access the recording of this program, as well as information on upcoming events. Thank you.
All right, thanks, everybody. So appreciate it.